Welcome to my world of wet flies. Wet flies have a very intrinsic value to me, but more to the point, the first trout I ever caught in my life, I caught on a wet fly. And obviously coming from United Kingdom, historically wet flies have history that goes back many, many years. They certainly, made some impact here in North America in the late 1800s, but by and large, a lot of, shall we say, the aspects that relate to either wet fly fishing or the tying of the flies are somewhat, to some extent, been lost. Although there's been, over the last few years, a resurrection in that. Certainly the Wet Fly Ways DVD that we produced has created a significant amount of interest. And, that's really obvious by the number of emails and telephone calls I have regarding the issues of that. But one thing we didn't kind of really put across in the DVD as far as the fishing techniques was concerned was the tying of those flies. And this DVD is all about the techniques to enable you to tie soft hackles and wet flies. Here in front of me are some of the flies that I personally choose to use. Some of these have got very historical values, their innovation goes back 200 years. And some of them have a more modern concept. And the reason that they do is because we have an availability of material today which 200 years ago we did not have. And I've no doubt in my mind whatsoever that tyers who innovate the flies of the past would have used the materials that we have available today if they'd have had those available to them at that time. But what I would like to do is just kind of give you a little bit of a brief overview historically of the evolution of wet flies. So, as I said, these are some of the flies that I personally choose to use. There's a massive range of wet flies out there, unbelievable to be honest. In fact, I would have to say that if you was to take into consideration the different variables of patterns of wet flies and soft hackles, they are greater than any other range of flies, be it dry flies, be it nymphs, streamers or whatever. But let's just take a look back a little bit historically. This book here, originally published in 1836, Ronald's, and you can see that it depicts how flies were, shall we say, constructed in relation to natural species. This here is a Danica mayfly. It's one of the largest mayfly species found in Europe. And typically, as you can see, flies in those days did not have hooks with eyes. They incorporated gut, whipped to the shank of the hook, and thereafter the fly was tied. But you can easily see that these flies typically represent a soft hackle wet fly structure as opposed to a dry fly structure. And then if we move on a little further from there, one of the companies in the world that pretty much was more responsible for, shall we say, introducing fly fishermen to not only product but also flies was the Hardy Company. And this is a catalogue going back to the late 1800s. And as you can see here, it depicts the typical style UK wet fly, which in many cases was originated to imitate a specific species. In some cases that was not necessarily true. So if we look at these flies here, these typically represent flies that were used for river and stream fishing orientations because they're fairly small, usually size 16s, 18s. And then when we move further over, we see there's a little bit more change here. We see flies that are more, shall we say, I would say more attractor patterns as opposed to direct representations of natural insects. And then as we go further through the catalogues of flies that are depicted, then we come to flies that are more in the dry fly range. Although there's not a lot of difference. The only main difference you see is how the wing is set, which is more upright as opposed to facing rearward, and or the hackle being wound more so at a right angle as opposed to a rearward inclination. What we also see is significant differences in the styles of flies. Typically these flies are orientated towards river and stream fishing, where they imitate various natural forms that the innovators of those tyres with the materials available to them try to duplicate. But if we then go to the other side of the story, we have typically flies here that are orientated to more lake and loch style fishing techniques. And as you can see, these flies are very different. They're much more gaudy in colour. So by definition, these are much more of an attractor type fly as opposed to this style of fly, which is more of an imitative style. What we then see is a transition, if that's the way to explain it, to the movement of, to some extent, known traditional fly patterns of the UK and the innovation of wet fly patterns here in North America. And typically, if you look on this page here, it illustrates some of the traditional flies of the UK origin, but we also see a leaning more so now toward flies of North American origin. And there are reasons for that. One is a species orientation. If you look here, for example, we see the light Hendrickson. The Hendrickson is not a species that exists in the United Kingdom. On the other hand, we also see flies like this here, the Professor and the Yellow Sally. These flies are more orientated towards, at the time, the species of fish that were fished for in the eastern regions, which were primarily brook trout, before the introduction of brown trout in the mid-1800s, and of course rainbow trout as we know today. So what we saw was kind of like an integration of UK patterns coming across into North America, but we also then saw the furtherance of innovation of American wetfly patterns, which either had an orientation towards species and or they were just essentially gaudy flies, which had some typical kind of relationship to the typical lake flies of UK origin. So they were more of an attractor nature of that particular type of fly, which was indicative to brook trout fishing because they orientate themselves more to taking flashy, gaudy looking flies. A wetfly comprises of essentially 5 components. In some cases maybe a few more than that, but essentially what you're looking at are these components: a tail, a body, a ribbing medium, a hackle, and a wing. Now in some cases, as I said, there may be less. You take a typical soft hackle, for example, maybe a simple thread body with a wound hackle, 2 components. But the issue is this: if you understand how to tie all these relative components, albeit you're using different materials, you can tie any wetfly pattern that's ever been innovated historically or in the future. And we're going to discuss first of all the nature of the materials that had some historical value and the modern materials that we have today, all of which produce you, by definition, traditional style wetfly, winged, hackled, and or soft hackle and or spider hackle. If you tend to look at this area here where I've got some materials displayed, typically you're going to see materials that were feathers of UK origin, shall we say, from UK species. So we'll take a good look here at some of those materials. Some of those, also orientate towards specifically well-known flies. In other words, the material or the feather used had a relationship to the name of the fly. And if we take this feather here, for example, this is the snipe feather. Snipe and purple, one very famous fly. And then moving on to that, we got the feathers from the woodcock, which is a game bird. Again, caddis flies, sedge flies as they're known in the UK. Nice brown orientated mottled feather, perfect for imitating that species. And then some of the North Country flies also use feathers from wader birds. One of the most popular and known ones at that time is the golden plover. Some of this stuff's not quite so easy to get today, but nevertheless, I think it's interesting for you to kind of have some background knowledge of this. Grouse, red grouse, still a very popular feather, easily obtainable. A lot of the traditional flies use that, both lake flies and flies used for river and stream. Jackdaw, that's a member of the crow family. These small grey dunny hackles here were taken off and used for a soft hackle fly. Really, really good to imitate the small mayfly species that were typically found in the North Country streams, but also work extremely well here for imitations of blue-winged olives and small mayfly species of that nature. Starling in itself, also European starling introduced here into North America, I think around about in late 1800s or something of that region. Very useful feather. You either use the body feathers or you take parts off the top of the wings and or you use the wing quills themselves for forming wings on flies, particularly small flies. They're not much used for the larger fly patterns. And as you know, I previously discussed with you earlier on, a lot of the lake flies incorporated more exotic feathers, golden pheasant, crest and tippet. Jungle cock cheeks were often used on a lot of those flies. Peacock, still as good today as it ever was historically, both for bodies of flies and wings in some cases. Typically the Alexander used the peacock sword for its wing mediums. Then we got other game bird skins. Hen pheasant, very popular. It's got very useful hackles at the neck end, different shades of tan to dark brown. But probably one of the most well-known of all hackles ever used is that obtained from the Hungarian or the grey partridge. You've got the grey hackles at the head end, and you've got the brown hackles down the middle of the back section. So the whole series of partridge flies, partridge and hare's ear, partridge and yellow, partridge and green, typically all incorporate the use of the partridge hackle. Moving on from that, we have a whole range of myriad of different hackles that are available out there today, either hen or rooster. There's a misconception to some extent that wet flies incorporate only soft hackles. That's not absolutely true. A lot of the traditional flies actually incorporate the use of rooster hackles, either for the wound palmed body hackle medium and or for the head hackle medium. And there used to be a train of thought, I don't totally buy that one, was that you used stiffer hackles when you fished in faster flowing water and soft hackles when you fished them in slower flowing water. Frankly, like I said, I don't buy that. I think a lot of that has to do today by the techniques that we use to fish those flies, how you manipulate and work those flies, and so they visibly appear to the fish's eye as something that's more natural, and they come up and eat it. You know, if you take an example here, for example, these are Irish wet fly patterns that were used to fish on the natural lakes to imitate the large Danica mayfly. I mean, there's just a whole ton of different material out there that suit different fly patterns. Wing quills are an important issue too. A lot of those flies incorporated historically wing mediums from birds that were either shot as vermin or for game. This is hen pheasant wing quill, for example. Also, we would use typically the hen pheasant centertail. A lot of the flies I personally use incorporate this material. And again, there's an orientation to the nature of the material, to the kind of fly. Typically this kind of fly would incorporate sedgy orientations, shall we say. Same likewise for this one. And then if you move on to the area of duck wing quills, and again they're in natural colors of gray or various colors of dyed mediums. They're either used as single color for a wing medium, or they may well be married to 2 or 3 strips of different colors. Also turkey and other feathers at that time were typically used. Swan feathers, well of course you can no longer do that. So what you essentially done is you built a married wing formation of a small version, kind of like an Atlantic salmon fly. Then moving on to that, seal fur was unquestionably the standard material so far as, shall we say, material that could be dyed different colors. And a lot of traditional flies incorporate natural seal fur dyed to suit the specific fly pattern in question. Today, we have availability of unbelievable resources so far as different dubbing materials. And you know, if you just take a pan view of whatever we've got here, there's just so many different colors and variations and different structures in those materials. You know, typically years ago, hare's fur, taken from the mask of the hare, was probably the #1. Mole fur was another. Whatever else was available out there, you know, as a natural medium, weasel fur, whatever it was, stoat fur. Today, most of those materials we generally don't use because we've got a lot more availability of blends and structures of dubbing material which ties of the past didn't have. So, you know, it's just unbelievable the resources that we've got with material structure today. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to move on, and I'm going to teach you some of the basic elements of tying what I described earlier on, the 5 elements of a traditional wet fly or soft tackle, because they essentially amount to the same thing, which are tails, bodies, ribbons, hackles and wings.